Good afternoon, everyone. I'm James Axelin Gomez, and today let's talk about the high tide of imperialism. No? So, what is imperialism? So, imperialism is like a big country, no, flexing its muscles to control smaller ones. So, it's about dominating other lands, usually for resources or strategic advantages. So, this can involve military force, economic control, or cultural influence. It's a power play that often leads to exploitation and inequality between the imperial power and the colonized territories. So in imperialism, there are many forms, no? So first is colony, second is protectorate, third is sphere of influence, and the last one is economic imperialism. So what is colony? So colony is a country or a territory governed by internally by foreign power. So think of a colony like a little piece of one country planted in another place. It's like a mini version of the ruling country, but usually far away from home. So the ruling country calls the shots in the colony, making decisions and often reaping the benefits, while the people living there might have less say in what happens to them. So it's a relationship that's all about control and influence, no? The second is protectorate. So a country or a territory with its own internal government but under the control of an outside power. So a protectorate is a kind of like having a big brother watching over you. So it's when a stronger country agrees to protect the weaker one, usually in exchange for some control or influence. So the weaker country gets some help with defense or governance, but it is also has to follow the lead of the stronger one on certain matters. It's a bit like having a safety net, but sometimes that net comes with strings attached. The third one is sphere of influence, so an area in which an outside power claims exclusive investment or trading privileges. So sphere of influence is a bit like it's like a powerful country claims a certain region or country as its own turf, where it gets to have more say and sway than others. So this can involve economic, political, or even military control. But it's all about having the upper hand in that particular area. So it's like drawing a line in the sand and saying, "This is mine." And the last one is economic imperialism. So an independent but less developed country controlled by private business interests rather than other governments. So economic imperialism is like giant company taking over smaller businesses. It's when a powerful nation uses its economic strength to dominate other countries. So controlling their markets, resources, and trade. So sometimes this can lead to unequal relationships where the dominant country benefits more often at the expenses of the weaker ones. So economic imperialism is all about money and power, with the rich getting richer while others struggle to keep up. Next is the management methods. If there's forms of imperialism, there's also a management methods in imperialism. No? So first is direct control, and the last one is indirect rule or indirect control. So direct control in imperialism is like a boss managing every detail of their employees' work. It's when a ruling country takes full control of another territory, often through military occupation or colonial administration. So this means they make all the decisions from laws to governance and have a heavy hand in how things are run. It's a top-down approach where the ruling country's influence is felt in every aspect of life in the colonized territory. No? And the last one is indirect rule or indirect control is in imperialism is like pulling strings from behind the scenes. Instead of directly ruling a territory, the imperial power works through local leaders or institutions to maintain control. It's a more suitable approach where the ruling country might influence policies and decisions without openly in charge. This can involve things like economic manipulation, cultural influence, or supporting friendly governments. It's like having a puppet master pulling the strings without being seen. So, so now let's hear the story of Africa. No? Yan ang experience sa imperialism. So Africa back then was a vibrant continent with diverse cultures, rich in resources, and bustling trade routes. So back then, before imperialism, African societies were thriving with kingdoms, empires, and traditional ways of life. People traded goods like gold, ivory, and spices, and many societies had complex social structures and system of governance. But when imperialism hit Africa, everything changed. European powers swooped in, carving up the continent like a pie at the banquet. They imposed their rule through force and manipulation, exploiting Africa's resources and people for their own gain. This led to widespread suffering and disruption as African societies were disrupted. Traditional economies were undermined and cultures were suppressed. So now let's know the events in Africa. So South Africa was officially colonized in 1652. So how South Africa colonized no sa mga Dutch? So in the early 17th century, the Dutch were rapidly expanding their maritime trade routes around the world, seeking to establish a strategic halfway point between Europe and the valuable trade markets of the East Indies, or in the modern day Indonesia. The Dutch East India Company set its sights on the southern tip of Africa. So this region was known as the known to mga European sailors as the Cape of Good Hope, no. So in 1652, the VOC, or the Dutch East India Company, under the leadership of Jan van Riebeeck, established a refreshment station at the Cape of Good Hope. The station served as a crucial resupply point for VOC ships traveling between the Netherlands and the East Indies. Initially, the Dutch presence was primarily focused on trade and maintaining a foothold in the region to support their lucrative spice trade routes. However, as Dutch settlers began to establish farms and settlements in the Cape region, tensions with the indigenous Khoikhoi people escalated. The Dutch settlers, known as the Boers, sought to expand their agricultural land and resources, leading to conflicts over territory and resources with the Khoikhoi and other indigenous groups. To consolidate their control over the Cape Colony and protect their interests, the Dutch East India Company began to implement a system of colonial governance. So they introduced policies such as land grants to European settlers, which further marginalized the indigenous population and solidified Dutch control over the territory. So additionally, the Dutch East India Company imported enslaved people from other parts of Africa and Asia to work on farms and in other labor-intensive industries, further shaping the demographic and social landscape of the Cape Colony. So over time, the Dutch presence in South Africa grew, and the Cape Colony became an important Dutch colonial outpost. Dutch culture, language, and legal systems became entrenched in the region, laying the foundation for future European colonization and other eventual establishment and apartheid in South Africa. So the colonization of South Africa by the Dutch in 1652 was really driven by a combination of economic interest, strategic positioning, and the desire to expand the Dutch influence in the region. No? Because of the expansion of the territory sa mga enemy, so there's now a slavery na nahitabo. No? So in 1808, the slave trade was declared illegal in both Great Britain and the United States. So Great Britain and United States made a bold move by declaring the transatlantic slave trade illegal. So imagine being turned from your home, forced into a ship and treated like a property just because of the color of your skin. So it's very cool, right? So there's a lot of activists, no, na nag-support nga nahimong anti-slavery, no, like William Wilberforce. So William Wilberforce were leading the charge in shining of a light on the brutality of the slave trade. So and also over in the US, voices against slavery were getting louder too. So the government took action. In 1807, Britain passed a law banning the slave trade, and the US followed suit with its own law. So even after the slave trade was outlawed, there was still a long road ahead to end slavery altogether and ensure freedom and equality for all. And after pag-declare legal sa Great Britain ug United States, ming sunod na ang British Empire, no. In 1834, slavery was abolished in British Empire. So what are the reasons, no? So first reason is abolitionist movement. Throughout the late 18th and early 19th centuries, there was a growing movement against the institution of slavery. So abolitionist groups composed of activists, intellectuals, religious leaders, and enslaved individuals themselves campaigned tirelessly for the abolition of slavery. Their efforts included publishing anti-slavery literature, organizing boycotts, and petitioning parliament for legislative change, no? And the second is economic shifts. So the Industrial Revolution brought about significant economic changes in Britain and its colonies. Industrialization led to the rise of factory-based production and a shift away from the labor-intensive agricultural practices that relied on enslaved labor. As a result, the economic importance of slavery to the British Empire began to diminish. And the third one is slave revolts and resistance. Enslaved people in the Caribbean and other British colonies actively resisted their enslavement through various means, including rebellions, escapes, and sabotage. These acts of resistance highlighted the inherent brutality and injustice of the institution of slavery and contributed to public outrage and support for abolition. Number 4 is humanitarian concerns. The moral and ethical implications of slavery become increasingly difficult for British society to ignore. Abolitionist arguments focus on the inherent dignity and rights of all human beings, regardless of race or status. Influential figures such as William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson played pivotal roles in galvanizing public opinion and garnering support for abolition. And the fifth one is legislative action. In 1807, the British Parliament passed the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act, which prohibited the transatlantic slave trade. This marked an important milestone to the abolitionist movement, but it did not abolish slavery itself. However, the momentum generated by the abolition of the slave trade laid the groundwork for further legislative actions. So next is Zanzibar. So Zanzibar is located off the coast of East Africa. So it was a historically major trading hub due to its strategic location along maritime routes linking Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. So Zanzibar's geographical position made it a vital center for the trade of spices, ivory, gold, and slaves. So now, while Zanzibar's role in trading brought prosperity to the region, it also had a dark side. The trade of slaves was a significant part of Zanzibar's economy for centuries, with countless individuals forcibly taken from Africa and sold into slavery. This exploitation had devastating consequences for African communities and contributed to the suffering of millions of people. The end of Zanzibar as a major trading hub came with the decline of slave trade and the rise of European colonialism in Africa. So in 1890, Zanzibar became a British protectorate, so marking the beginning of the end of its status as an independent trading power. With the abolition of the slave trade and the shift towards legitimate commerce, Zanzibar's economy underwent significant changes. Dr. David Livingstone. So, Dr. David Livingstone dedicated his life to exploring the uncharted territories of Africa. So, venturing deep into the heart of the continent at a time when much of it remained a mystery to the outside world. So, Dr. David Livingstone didn't just go for adventure, although he is viewed as an explorer rather than a missionary, no, when he visited in Africa. So, Livingstone uncovered the harsh realities of the slave trade, witnessing firsthand the suffering and brutality inflicted upon African communities. He documented his findings and used his influence to campaign tirelessly against the slave trade, rallying support back in Europe and inspiring others to join the cause. But Livingstone's legacy goes beyond his efforts to end slavery. He also played a key role in opening up Africa to trade and commerce, paving the way for future developments on the continent. So in 1880, most of Africa was still independent, no? Because European colonization hadn't fully taken hold yet. So many African societies had their own governments, cultures, and system of governance. While there were some European outposts along the coast, the interior regions were largely untouched by colonial powers. However, this would soon change as European nations intensified their scramble for African territories in the late 19th century, leading the colonization and division of much of the continent. So next is Muhammad Ahmad, so also known as the Mahdi, rose to prominence in Sudan in the late 19th century as a religious and political leader. So he played a significant role in changing the authority of the Egyptian and the British colonial powers in the region. So Ahmad's contribution to Sudanese history lies in his establishment of a movement known as Mahdi's movement, which sought to reform Islamic society and resist foreign domination. So he proclaimed himself as the Mahdi or the guided one and rallied followers to his cause, promising to lead them to victory against the oppressors. Now, the most notable event in Muhammad Ahmad's legacy is his confrontation with the British colonial administrator, General Charles Gordon. At the siege of Khartoum in 1884 to 1885, Gordon, tasked with evacuating Egyptian forces from Sudan, found himself besieged by Mahdi's forces led by Ahmad. So the siege of Khartoum became a symbol of the clash between colonial powers and indigenous resistance in Africa. So despite Gordon's effort to defend the city, including the construction of barricades and fortifications, Khartoum fell to the Mahdi's forces after the prolonged siege. The battle between Muhammad Ahmad and Charles Gordon marked a turning point in Sudanese history. So it demonstrated the strength of the Mahdist movement and the failure of British colonial policies in the region. So the fall of Khartoum led to a period of Mahdist rule in Sudan, with Ahmad's successor Khalifa Abdullahi establishing control over much of the country. So next is in 1890s, wherein the Britain and France reached the brink of conflict at Fashoda. So the brink of conflict at Fashoda between Britain and France in 1898 was primarily due to their imperial ambitions in Africa. So both nations sought to expand their colonial territories and influence, particularly in the Nile region of Sudan. At Fashoda, located in the present-day South Sudan, French forces under the leadership of Captain Jean-Baptiste Bertrand clashed with British forces led by Major General Horatio Kitchener. The confrontation arose from conflicting territorial claims and the desire to control the headwaters of the Nile River. Tensions escalated as both Britain and France asserted their claims to Fashoda and surrounding region. However, the crisis was ultimately diffused through diplomatic negotiations, with both nations realizing the risk military conflict. The resulting Fashoda incident led to the signing of the Anglo-French Entente Cordiale in 1904, which resolved colonial disputes and paved the way for cooperation between the two powers. So in 1898, the British and Egyptian troops seized the Sudan. So the British and Egyptian troops seized Sudan primarily due to economic interest and strategic importance of the region, which was under the rule of Mahdist regime led by Khalifa Abdul Yahi. So now the Mahdist regime, established after Muhammad Ahmad's uprising, posed a threat to British and Egyptian interests in Sudan. So in response, joint British and Egyptian forces led by British General Herbert Kitchener launched a military campaign to reconquer Sudan and suppress the Mahdist rebellion. So in 1898, at the Battle of Omdurman, British and Egyptian forces decisively defeated the Mahdist army, effectively ending Mahdist rule in Sudan. So Khalifa Abdul Yahi was captured and subsequently executed, marking the end of the Mahdist regime. So the seizure of Sudan by British and Egyptian troops solidified British control over the region and allowed for the establishment of Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. So a condominium governed jointly by Britain and Egypt. So this period marked a significant chapter in Sudanese history, shaping its trajectory and under the colonial rule. So next is in 1910, Independent Union of South Africa. So this union promised new opportunities for economic growth and development, with the potential to harness the diverse resources and talents of the region. It also marked a step toward stability and progress as the new government sought to address the challenges facing the country. But, and here's where the things get complicated. There was a dark side to this independence. You see, despite the promise of equality and democracy, the reality was far from fair. The new government enshrined racial discrimination into law, implementing policies that systematically marginalized and oppressed the black population. One of the most glaring injustices was the denial of political rights to black South Africans, while white citizens were granted full voting rights and political representation. Black South Africans were excluded from political process, denied the right to vote, and effectively shut out from having a say in their own governance. This institutional racism laid the foundation for decades of inequality and injustice, perpetuating a system of segregation and discrimination known as apartheid. It's a painful legacy that continues to haunt South Africa to this day, reminding us of the long road through equality and injustice for all. Next is in 1922, the division of Northern and Southern Rhodesia. So, Northern Rhodesia, located in what is now Zambia, was established as a British protectorate in the late 19th century. Its development was heavily influenced by the discovery of valuable mineral resources like copper, which attracted European settlers and fueled economic growth. Meanwhile, Southern Rhodesia, known today as Zimbabwe, was a separate British colony established by Cecil Rhodes and his British South Africa Company. It was rich in agricultural land and also experienced boom in mining, particularly of gold and other minerals. Now, the division between the two regions wasn't just geographical, it was also political and cultural. Southern Rhodesia had a larger population of European settlers who dominated political and economic power, while Northern Rhodesia had a more diverse population, including indigenous African groups. Over time, these differences deepened, and each region developed its own distinct identity and aspirations. Southern Rhodesia, with its predominantly white settler population, pursued a path towards self-government and eventually declared unilateral and independence from Britain in 1965, leading to years of conflict and international isolation. Meanwhile, Northern Rhodesia followed a different trajectory, eventually gaining independence as the Republic of Zambia in 1964, with a focus on promoting African majority rule and social justice. So the division between northern and southern Rhodesia was just a matter of geography. It was a reflection of complex historical, political, and economic forces that shaped the destiny of these two nations in southern Africa. So before the era of imperialism, so India boasted an array of valuable resources that underpinned its vibrant civilization. So India's fertile soil and favorable climate nurtured a thriving agricultural sector, yielding abundant crops like rice, wheat, cotton, and spices. This agricultural wealth formed the cornerstone of the economy, sustaining livelihoods and ensuring food security for the populace. And also, India was blessed with rich mineral deposits including iron ore, coal, limestone, and precious stones. These resources fueled early industries, supported craftsmanship, and contributed to the trade and commerce both domestically and internationally. And also in India, dense forests covering vast expanses of the subcontinent provided a bounty of timber, medical plants, and other forest products. And also, indigenous communities relied on forests for sustenance, shelter, and traditional medicine, while the forests themselves supported diverse ecosystems and biodiversity. So, in India's extensive networks of rivers, lakes, and reservoirs serve as vital water resources, facilitating irrigation, transportation, and domestic needs. So, rivers like Ganges, Yamuna, and Brahmaputra were lifelines for millions, enabling agriculture, trade, and cultural exchange. Furthermore, India's rich cultural heritage, characterized by ancient traditions, language, arts, and sciences, was a valuable resource on its own right. Diverse civilization, including Indus Valley civilization, Vedic culture, and empires like the Mauryas and Guptas, contributed to a tapestry of knowledge and tradition that defined Indian society. So now, let's talk about the experience or the events happened in India during the imperialism. So Thomas Babington Macaulay was a pivotal figure during the British colonial period in India. So he is known for his influence on educational policy. So one of his significant contribution was the implementation of the English education system through the English Education Act of 1835. So Macaulay advocated for English to be the medium of instruction in Indian schools, supplanting traditional languages and classical texts. Macaulay's main aim in promoting English education in India was multifaceted. Firstly, he believed that English education would facilitate the spread of Western ideas, knowledge, and values among the Indian population by imparting English language skills and introducing Indian students to Western literature, science, and philosophy. Macaulay aimed to create a class of Anglicized Indians who would serve as intermediaries between British colonial authorities and the indigenous population. Secondly, Macaulay saw English education as a tool for social and cultural assimilation. He believed that by adopting English language and culture, Indians would become more receptive to British influence and governance. Additionally, Macaulay argued that English education would contribute to economic modernization by equipping Indians with the skills necessary to participate in global economy dominated by the British Empire. However, the implementation of English education had negative repercussions on traditional Indian culture and religion, including Hinduism. The emphasis of English language and Western curriculum led to a marginalization of indigenous languages, literature, and religious texts. As English medium schools proliferated across India, traditional Hindu education, which was often conducted in vernacular language and focused on religious teaching, began to decline. The promotion of English education contributed to a sense of cultural alienation and loss of identity among certain segments of Indian population as Indian students embraced Western education and values. There was a gradual erosion of traditional Hindu beliefs and practices. Additionally, the English education system was often associated with Christian missionary efforts, leading to apprehensions among Hindus and about the conversion of their children to Christianity. Still, the legacy of Macaulay's education reforms continues to shape India's cultural landscape, highlighting the complex interplay between colonialism, modernization, and indigenous identities. So, in the 1850s, there was a significant movement of Indian troops and ships abroad. So, primarily driven by the strategic interests of the British Empire and exigencies of colonial rule. So, this period was marked by various factors that necessitated the development of Indian troops overseas, and it's crucial to understand the context behind this phenomenon. Firstly, during the mid-19th century, the British Empire was expanding its colonial territories across different parts of the world. To maintain control over the vast territories and protect British interests, particularly in regions like Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. So the British authorities relied heavily on military forces. Indian troops comprising soldiers recruited from various regions of colonial India played a crucial role in the British military apparatus. So secondly, the 1850s witnessed several conflicts and military engagement in different parts of the world where British interests were at stake. For instance, the Crimean War in Europe, the Anglo-Burmese War in Southeast Asia, and the various campaigns in Africa and the Middle East required the development of sizable military contingents. Indian troops were often called upon to participate in these conflicts alongside British forces, showcasing their versatility and adaptability in diverse terrains and environments. Furthermore, the British East India Company, which initially controlled large parts of India before the establishment of direct British colonial rule, had its interests spread across multiple regions. The company's mercantile and commercial activities, along with its territorial ambitions, necessitated the development of Indian troops to safeguard trade routes, protect colonial outposts, and suppress local resistance movements. Moreover, the British authorities often utilized Indian troops for imperial policing duties in various colonies and protectorates. So Indian soldiers were deployed to maintain law and order, quell rebellions, and enforce colonial administration in regions where local population posed challenges to British rule. And the British military infrastructure, including naval bases and garrisons, required a constant influx of personnel to sustain operations and ensure territorial control. So Indian troops were, with their combat prowess and familiarity with the colonial environments, were often chosen for overseas deployment to fulfill these strategic imperatives. So this period exemplifies the intricate dynamics of colonialism and the integral role played in Indian soldiers in sustaining British imperial power on a global scale. So the first rail work in India was inaugurated in 1853. So with the opening of the first passenger train service between Mumbai, which is now called Mumbai, and Tain. This event heralded a new era of modern transportation infrastructure in the subcontinent. Prior to the advent of railways, travel and trade in India were largely dependent on traditional means such as bullock carts, horses, and waterways, which were slow and insufficient and often unreliable. The introduction of railways revolutionized transportation by offering a faster, safer, and more reliable mode of travel over long distances. So this had profound implications for Indian populace as it facilitated mobility and connectivity across different regions of the country. So people could now travel greater distance in a fraction of the time it took previously, leading to increased social and cultural exchange, migration, and economic opportunities. So for the Indian people, especially to those living in to those who live in rural areas, the railways opened up access to urban centers, markets, employment opportunities, and educational institutions. It facilitated the movement of goods, services, and labor, contributing to the integration of diverse regions and communities within the Indian subcontinent. The railways played a crucial role in promoting economic development and trade. So the efficient transportation of raw materials, agriculture produce and manufactured goods fostered the growth of commercial agriculture, industries, and markets. So businessmen and entrepreneurs benefited immensely from the expanded market reach and reduced transportation costs afforded by the railways. The railways also stimulated the growth of urban centers and industrial hubs along railway lines, leading the emergence of new economic centers and trade routes. Cities such as Mumbai, Calcutta, which is now called Kolkata, and Madras, which is now called Chennai, become major railway junctions and commercial hubs attracting investments, industries, and skilled labor. And also, the railways facilitated the movement of capital, technology, and expertise, accelerating the pace of industrialization and modernization in India. So it enabled the efficient extraction of resources such as coal, iron, and minerals from hinterlands to industrial centers, fueling the growth of key industries such as textiles, steels, and shipping. The advent of the first rail network in India had transformative impact on the Indian people and the businessmen alike. It revolutionized transportation, communication, and commerce, fostering mobility, connectivity, and economic development and social changes across the subcontinent. The railways laid the foundation for modern India's transportation infrastructure and played a pivotal role in shaping its economic, social, and cultural landscape. So next is the first textile, no, which is established in 1854. So the first textile in India was established in 1854 in Bombay, which is now called Mumbai, no. So ushering in the era of modern industrial manufacturing in the subcontinent. So prior to the advent of textile mills, India had a rich tradition of handloom weaving and textile production, which was primarily carried out in small-scale cottage industries and rural households. So the establishment of textile mills introduced mechanized production techniques powered by steam engines and later electricity, which revolutionized the textile industry. So these mills employed large scale of machinery to spin yarn, weave cloth, and carry out various finishing processes, significantly increasing the efficiency and output of textile production. The impact of the first textile mill on the Indian people was profound. Firstly, it created employment opportunities for a large number of people, particularly in urban areas where the mills were concentrated. The influx of labor from rural areas to urban centers in search of employment led to the growth of industrial towns and cities around the textile mills clusters. Secondly, the establishment of textile mills provided a steady source of income for workers, improving their standard of living and economic well-being. Factory jobs offered regular wages, benefits, and opportunities for skill development, which attracted workers from diverse backgrounds including rural migrants and artisans replaced by mechanization. The growth of textile industry stimulated ancillary industries and support services such as transportation, trading, banking, and housing, creating a multiplier effect on the economy. It fostered the growth of a vibrant ecosystem of suppliers, distributors, and service providers, contributing to economic diversification of and urbanization. Furthermore, the expansion of textile manufacturing spurred technological innovation and modernization in India. Mills invested in new machinery, techniques, and processes to enhance productivity, quality, and efficiency. So this led to the adoption of advanced manufacturing practices and the development of skilled labor, laying the foundation for industrial growth in other sectors of the economy. So in addition, the textile industry played a crucial role in promoting trade and commerce both domestically and internationally. So Indian textiles renowned for their quality and craftsmanship found markets across the globe, contributing to foreign exchange earnings and economic growth. The textile industry emerged as a key driver of industrialization and modernization, shaping India's economic landscape and societal transformation. And next is the divide and rule policy and the Sepoy Rebellion. So the divide and rule policy was a strategy employed by the British colonial administrators to maintain control over India by exploiting existing divisions and differences among its diverse population. The British recognized the religious, cultural, linguistic, and regional diversity of India and sought to manipulate these divisions to their advantage. They fostered tensions between different religious and ethnic communities such as Hindus and Muslims, by favoring one group over the other in administrative and political matters. By sowing discord and mistrust among the Indian populace, the British hoped to weaken potential sources of resistance and consolidate their own power. The Sepoy Rebellion, which erupted in 1857, was a widespread uprising by Indian soldiers, which is what we called Sepoys. So in the British East India Company, armies against British rule. The rebellion was sparked by various factors including the grievances among the Sepoys over the issues such as low pay, harsh working conditions, and perceived cultural and religious disrespect. So moreover, rumors spread among the Sepoys that the cartridges for the rifles were greased with animal fat, pork, and beef fat, which offended both Hindu and Muslim soldiers' religious belief. The impact of divide and rule policy and the Sepoy Rebellion on India was profound. The policy exacerbated existing divisions in Indian society, fostering mistrust and animosity between different religious and ethnic communities. This contributed to social tensions and conflicts that persisted long after British colonial rule. No? The Sepoy Rebellion, although ultimately suppressed by British forces, had far-reaching consequences. It led to the dissolution of the British East India Company and the transfer of control over India to the British Crown, which is the beginning of the British Raj. The rebellion also prompted the British government to reassess its policies in India, leading to reforms aimed at addressing some of the grievances that had fueled the uprising. However, the Sepoy Rebellion also led to a period of increased repression and control by the British authorities as they sought to prevent future uprisings and maintain their grip on power. The rebellion deepened mistrust between Indians and British colonial administration, laying groundwork for future nationalist movement and ultimately contributing to India's struggle for independence. So next is let's talk about Southeast Asia. So before imperialism, Southeast Asia was a region characterized by diverse cultures, vibrant trade networks, and flourishing economies. Various indigenous kingdoms and empires such as Khmer Empire in the present-day Cambodia and the Srivijaya Empire in the present-day Indonesia thrived due to their strategic locations along major trade routes. Economic resources were abundant, including spices such as cloves, nutmeg, and pepper, as well as valuable commodities like gold, silver, and timber. Agriculture was a key economic activity, with rice cultivation being particularly important. However, with the arrival of European powers like the British, Dutch, French, and Portuguese in the 16th century, Southeast Asia underwent significant changes. So, imperialism brought about colonization and exploitation of the region's resources, leading to socio-economic disruptions and political instability. The Europeans established colonial administrations, exploiting local labor and resources for their own economic gain. And this period also witnessed the introduction of cash crops like rubber and tea, which transformed the agrarian landscape and contributed to the rise of plantation economies. So now let's talk the important events that happened in imperialism in Southeast Asia. So Stamford Raffles. So he was just not a historical figure but a pivotal character in shaping the trajectory of Singapore history. When Raffles arrived on the shores of Singapore, it was merely a small fishing village inhabited by a diverse mix of Malay, Chinese, and indigenous communities. So Raffles recognized the strategic importance of Singapore's location at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula. He saw the potential for Singapore to serve as a vital trading post for the British India Company, linking the lucrative markets of China and India. With this vision in mind, Raffles negotiated with the local Malay rulers and secured the island for the British crown. So under Raffles' administration, Singapore quickly transformed. He implemented policies to promote free trade, enticing merchants and traders from around the region to settle on the island. Raffles also modernized Singapore infrastructure, constructing roads, bridges, and public buildings. So his efforts laid the foundation for Singapore's future development as a bustling commercial center. But perhaps Raffles' most enduring legacy is the multicultural society he helped to foster in Singapore, recognizing the importance of attracting immigrants to the island. Raffles welcomed people of various ethnicities and religions, creating a vibrant and cosmopolitan community. And today, Singapore stands as a testament to Raffles' vision and foresight. His establishment of a British colony paved the way for Singapore's emergence as a global trade and financial hub. Raffles' name is immortalized in Singapore history, with landmarks such as Raffles Hotel and Raffles Palace, Raffles Place serving as a reminders of his enduring influence. Next is the British attack on Lower Burma in 1826. So in 1826, the British attacked Lower Burma primarily to secure their economic interests and expand their colonial holdings in Southeast Asia. Lower Burma was strategically important due to its proximity to British-controlled territories in India and its rich agricultural resources. The British sought to gain control of Lower Burma's lucrative trade routes and natural resources including thick forests and valuable commodities like rice and cotton. Additionally, there were concerns about Burma's aggressions towards British interests in neighboring territories. The consequences of British attack was the signing of the Treaty of Yandabu in 1826, which ended the first Anglo-Burmese War. Under the treaty, Burma ceded significant territories to British India, including the Tenasserim Coast and the Arakan region. So this established British dominance in Lower Burma and marked the beginning of the British colonial rule in the region. In terms of battle itself, the British emerged victorious, leveraging their superior military technology and organizational powers to defeat the Burmese forces. The British victory solidified their control over Lower Burma and paved the way for further expansion of their colonial empire in Southeast Asia. So next is the agreement of British and French to preserve Thailand in 1896. So in the late 19th century, amidst the scramble for Southeast Asia by European colonial powers, both the British and the French recognized the strategic importance of preserving Thailand, also known as Siam, as a buffer state between the respective colonial possessions in Southeast Asia. So preserving Thailand served the interests of both colonial powers by maintaining a geopolitical balance in the region and preventing direct confrontation between British controlled Burma and the French controlled Indochina. This strategic decision helped Thailand retain its independence and sovereignty during the era of European imperialism. Now, turning to the role of King Mokdut, also known as King Rama, he played a crucial role in defending Thailand against colonizer. King Mongkut implemented a series of modernization reforms known as Thailandization policy, which aimed to modernize Thailand's institution and infrastructure while preserving its cultural identity and sovereignty. One of King Mokto's most notable achievements was his skillful diplomacy, which allowed Thailand to navigate the complex geopolitical landscape of 19th century Southeast Asia. By skillfully balancing relations with both the British and the French, King Mongkut managed to maintain Thailand's independence and avoid colonization. Next is the final piece in the colonial edifice in Southeast Asia. So, European colonial powers solidified their control over Southeast Asia. The final piece in this colonial edifice was the Philippines. After the Spanish-American War in 1898, the United States acquired the Philippines from Spain through the Treaty of Paris. Now, President McKinley faced a crucial decision regarding the fate of the Philippines. Recognizing the strategic importance of the Philippines, McKinley decided to turn the islands into an American colony rather than granting them independence. One of the primary motivation behind this decision was to prevent Philippines from failing or falling into the hands of the Japanese, who were expanding their influence in the region. By establishing American colonial rule over the Philippines, McKinley aimed to ensure stability and security in the region, safeguarding American interests and preventing potential Japanese expansionism. This decision marked a significant turning point in the history of the Philippines and had a far-reaching implication for the region's geopolitical landscape. Next is the Indo-Chinese Union. So, Indo-Chinese Union was significant as it brought together the territories of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia under French colonial rule in the late 19th and early 20th century. So, this union served as a key component of French colonial strategy in Southeast Asia, allowing for centralized administration and exploitation of the region's resources. It also facilitated economic integration and cultural assimilation, and it often at the expense of indigenous autonomy and identity. Overall, the Indo-Chinese played a crucial role in shaping the modern history and geopolitical dynamics of the Southeast Asia. So next is America's first war against guerrilla forces in Asia on 1901. So America's first encounter with guerrilla forces in Asia took place during the Philippine-American War, which lasted from 1899 to 1902. So the conflict arose following the United States acquisition of the Philippines from Spain after the Spanish-American War in 1898. Now, the Philippine-American War initially began as a struggle for Philippine independence against American colonial rule. However, after suffering defeats in conventional battles against the better-equipped American forces, Filipino insurgents led by figures such as Emilio Aguinaldo adopted guerrilla warfare tactics. Guerrilla warfare, characterized by hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, and small-scale engagement, posed a significant challenge to the American military, which was more accustomed to traditional warfare strategies. The rugged terrain and dense jungles of the Philippine archipelago provided ideal conditions for guerrilla operations, allowing Filipino insurgents to evade American patrols and launch surprise attacks. The American response to guerrilla warfare in the Philippines was marked by a series of brutal counterinsurgency campaigns. American forces employed tactics such as scoured earth policies, forced relocation of civilians, and torture methods in an attempt to suppress the insurgency. One notable event during this period was the Balangiga Massacre of 1901, where Filipino guerrillas launched a surprise attack on the American garrison in the town of Balangiga, killing 48 American soldiers. In retaliation, American forces launched a brutal campaign of reprisals, resulting in a widespread destruction and loss of civilian lives. Ultimately, America's first war against guerrillas in Asia during the Philippine-American War highlighted the challenges of unconventional warfare and the complexities of colonial rule. The conflict left a legacy of bitterness and resentment
among the Filipino population and underscored the human cost of imperial expansion and resistance. Next is French-controlled Vietnam in 1917. So in 1917, French control over Vietnam was driven by economic interests and strategic considerations. Vietnam, along with Laos and Cambodia, was part of French Indochina, which served as a valuable source of raw materials such as rubber, ice, and coal for the French colonial empire. Additionally, Vietnam's strategic location provided the French with access to key trade routes and markets in Southeast Asia. Now, concerning the timeline of Southeast Asian countries claiming their independence, it largely unfolded in the mid-20th century following the World War II. Many Southeast Asian nations including Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia began asserting their desire for independence from colonial rule during this period. Indochina declared its independence from Dutch colonial rule in 1945, while Vietnam fought a prolonged struggle for independence from French colonialism, culminating in the victory of the Viet Minh forces led by Ho Chi Minh in 1954. And similarly, the Philippines gained independence from American colonial rule in 1946, and Malaysia achieved independence from British colonial rule in 1957. So that's it, and I hope na mo na learn, and thanks for listening. Have a good day.